Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reality. My name is William. I'm here with Lev. How are you doing, Lev?
I'm good. Hi, everyone.
Today, our topic is wokeism. We want to discuss the ideas around woke culture and what it means and how it's being applied, and give some thoughts on this recent phenomenon in our culture. I thought I'd begin with a brief discussion of what wokeism is, maybe give a definition. I just looked it up, in the dictionary, Wikipedia dictionary. To be woke in general is to be aware of what is going on or well informed, especially in racial and other social justice issues. And then it gives another little description as holding left wing views. But I think the key element to it is that to be woke is to be aware of racial prejudice and discrimination. Wikipedia says that the concept originated in the US. It goes back a ways as just a phrase. Apparently, Leadbelly, a folk blues artist, in 1938, he wrote a song called, or sung a song called Scottsboro Boys. And this song was about black teenagers being accused of raping white teenagers or white women. They were all on a train. They were hoboing on a train, and there was some fight between the white boys and the black boys, and the white boys got kicked off the train. And then at the next stop, the police arrested the black boys and found that there were white women in the train. And then the white women accused them of raping them. So Leadbelly wrote this song about this situation, and in the end of the song, he used the phrase "woke," stay woke, as in, black people, you better stay aware of the racial tensions in your area and your situation in life. So that's kind of how it originated in popular culture, and then of course it became a phrase with the beatniks in the 60s, and more recently with the left in popular culture. So do you have any thoughts on that basic introduction, Lev?
Well, I think that's a good introduction to the cultural nature of the way we use the term in America and in modern society. But I would point out it's not just an idea that only exists in our cultures. We can almost say it starts with Plato's The Cave allegory, or the aspect of the cave where somebody gets out of the cave and they go out into the real world, see the truth of things, that they have some epiphany or realization about truth. They find the real nature of things, which anybody could be experienced with. Like, for a long time, they think a certain way. They come up with a new idea that makes everything more clear and life easier to understand. But then you are then aware of things in a new way, in a new light. But then you can bring those ideas to other people. Do other people see that way of looking at things? Do other people see the problems in life? So even the idea of being woke in a way does go all the way back to Plato, where it's like it's not a recent idea, that people do want to bring awareness to the truth of things and bring other people to the awareness as well, to change the nature of things or to change society, to improve it and all that. So it's not completely a left-wing thing as much as maybe something many people can relate to, that they want the ideal world, but not everybody notices. Not everybody realizes that what makes the world the way it is, the way it's come out in modern culture, is just new concerns over race, whether valid or not. I think that's where it comes from.
Yeah, it is an interesting philosophical idea. I think the term woke is black slang for just being awake or awakened. So I think you're onto something with the connection to Plato. It's kind of like a transformation of consciousness, but a more modern term is red pilled. So like in the
Yes.
movie The Matrix, Morpheus offers the protagonist Neo a blue or a red pill. If he takes the blue pill, he'll remain in his ignorant bliss of his world where he doesn't understand what's really going on. And if he takes the red pill, he'll follow Morpheus, and Morpheus will show him what's really going on in the world. So this concept broadly applies to a lot of ideas. Any new idea that awakens you to something, it's kind of like an enlightenment. One idea I had was that woke culture is sort of a type of enlightenment movement, but it's an enlightenment for the subjectivists, for the people who believe in the primacy of consciousness. But we can get to that later because I have more on this cave allegory. It reminds me of the phenomenon of an epiphany. So if you have like a sudden idea that you don't know where it came from, you realize something critical about you've answered a question that's been haunting you for a long time, and it just comes to you in a burst of inspiration. That might be similar to the feeling that you might get in the woke culture when someone tells you, you know, the whole system is racist. You know, there's this structural racism. And it's, if you never thought of that before, it might be like a mind-blowing perspective or worldview. It might change your worldview.
Yeah, that could explain the power of such a thing. I mean, like, it's one thing to say, oh, ideas change you, but to explain why is it so impactful? Maybe it is that, like, epiphany feeling. That's, like, this sudden connection to many things that gives it power. But the concern, of course, should be, is it based on something valid? Or as you said, is it, like, something for subjectivists or something to that effect? But I do think it captures the power of the feeling, whatever it might be, and why it's a cultural phenomena rather than just a underground thing.
Yeah, I think it's a deeply psychological idea or movement. I think it does capture a psychological power force that people experience, which I call epiphany. Other people could call being woke or awakened or critical consciousness. So even at its root, it's appealing to this feeling that people have. I think that's part of it. And that might be, as you say, why it's so impactful, because at some level, people are ready to believe this woke idea, believe all these woke ideas of equity and intrinsic racism, white fragility, all these types of ideas you hear from the left coming out these days. And this might be their view of progress. You know, they might say, well, we do need a society that is colorblind. We need racial equity. These are all like good ideas, right? So that they see that as progress. But then what happens is it gets twisted and manipulated. And what they think is progress is really just regression.
Yeah, I'm just trying to concretize this a bit more. What is an example of wokeness that you think is more exemplary of, like, the kind of phenomena we're thinking about? Like, I'm trying to think of, yeah, I'm aware of some ideas, but can you name some people that you're thinking of in particular?
There was that movement to protest STEM.
Yeah.
And they wanted, well, there's the whole idea of, whiteness. And part of whiteness is imposing your view of the scientific method on scientists, that sort of thing.
I've heard of that.
And so it might be an acceptable idea that we need to have more diverse views in science or more even diverse races in science, more black people, more brown people, that sort of thing. But then what happens is they start saying, well, you're imposing your rationality or your white reason on this science. They start spoiling what is true. There's true aspects to the scientific method that have been tried and worked, and they produce actual knowledge. But then if you start associating the method with some race, you start conflating things that aren't related, and you start packaging these things together in a false concept. That to me would be a regression, because you're moving the whole field of science away from achieving facts and truth.
Yeah. Well, I'm also thinking of cases where maybe I've seen or heard white people say that, like, they want to check their privilege, or they try to be an ally in the sense of trying to demean themselves. I can think of how people have talked about wanting more representation in certain types of movies, like this recent movie, In the Heights. I've heard some people complaining or criticizing the movie for not having enough dark-skinned Afro-Latino people in it. Not just saying that there's not enough Latino people or not enough Black people, but that their skin wasn't dark enough, that it wasn't representative enough of the dark skin community in real life. And that was, I think, a clear example of wokeness in modern culture that isn't just being critical of certain things, but a certain kind of criticalness about race, more about something that seems more subjective, like who's to say what dark enough is, other than just some sense of darkness. There's no, like, it's not like you have a swatch to decide if somebody's dark enough. It's just almost baseless.
Like they have no reason other than the skin color to suggest including these people.
Yeah, or saying that it's not representative enough. It's not capturing my experience as a dark-skinned Afro-Latino. It doesn't capture my experience that I understand. Therefore, it should represent me more, because they're not aware of their racial prejudices.
Yeah, there's the whole concept of lived experience.
Yeah.
Like my truth. And it seems very tied to your race. Well, I'm a white guy, so let's say I'm watching a movie about Denzel Washington playing a character like in The Equalizer, where he's a former CIA agent and he goes around helping people solve their problems and getting revenge on people who've wronged them. And then I suddenly come out and say, well, that should be a white guy because I can't relate to Denzel Washington. He's black. That'd be ridiculous. That's racist. It's a sad situation, really, when you think that you require a person the same color in order to relate to them. It's just focusing on skin color, and I think that's basically what being woke is. It's become that. It used to be, I think, probably a more serious view of racial tensions when there were actually institutional racism, where there was actually institutional racism. They would say, stay woke, be aware of these Jim Crow laws that you're having to deal with, or these racist laws. But now we don't have the sort of racial laws that we had back in early to mid 20th century. But people are still using the phrase as if we have this institutional racism, and it's becoming harder and harder to show any sort of structural racism.
Yeah.
It's
even if there were, it's like a difference of very different kinds. If we're talking about like in a movie versus, oh, the government's doing something or something related to laws. I mean, it seems even more detached when you're saying the movie, like In the Heights, is expressing some sort of inherent racism and privilege in it, which is almost going too far. Like what is it that they're even criticizing as much as is just complaining about somebody not acting in maybe the most ideal way, or is it truly a criticism of society? He's almost making it trivializing their actual things that should be concerns. I mean, real racism would be concerning. Well, most glaring examples of racism are purely evil, but you're trivializing it if you're just applying wokeness to like something like, oh, somebody didn't put enough dark-skinned people in movies. Like, fine, you can think that, but is that really what you want to even spend any time talking about? Maybe you could say as a backhand comment, but to really take any time, more than 5 minutes to make a thing of it, what's the point of all this? It seems more of a second-handed thing rather than a genuine concern about some racial issue, even if there weren't any racial issues. Like, regardless, even if they were all completely wrong, at least someone could have a legitimate, or at least attempt to make it legitimate, rather than trivializing.
Well, you ask what are they criticizing, and I think you rightly note that much of it seems just like complaining about trivial things. I think that's true. I think what's happening is we've eliminated most of the physical barriers for minorities to enter society or achieve or succeed in society. So what's happening now is they can't look outward to objective reality and find racism. So what they're doing is they're pointing inward to people's motives and or psychology and saying there's still racism because I know what his motive is, and his motive for not opening the door for me is because he's a racist. It's a psychological religion.
Yeah.
It's basically turning into a dogma about people's motives. And they're saying everyone's a racist. There's intrinsic racism in your soul. And this reminds me of Christianity or even Judaism, where the Bible has all these myths in it about creationism and all sorts of things and history. And science has undermined it and has proven a lot of these myths ridiculous. And so what's happened is Christianity has become very psychological. It's all about the Holy Spirit now. Jesus lives in your soul. You're born again. So they can't go outward to give you evidence for their dogma. So they move inward to the soul or the spirit or your nature and try to make that the bad part of you. And so then you go, oh man, I am really a racist guy. And then people who are confused about their own psychology, this becomes a dogma for them about their own soul. They're like, oh, I don't know why I did that. Maybe it's true that I'm a racist and I have these intrinsic or inherently racist ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. That's about going inward to find the criticism, which is almost worse than being mistaken going outwards. Like, I'm thinking of how, no matter how wrong a Marxist is, at least they attempt to refer to reality. They would attempt to go outward to explain things, not as much inward. And they at least try to refer to something, and you could argue against them and attempt to refute them, get an argument and prove them wrong. But you can't prove it wrong, like about going inward, really. How do you prove wrong that you weren't really being racist? Like, how do you prove your own feelings to somebody else? You can't just show a picture of your feelings. So in a way, you can escape real criticism of your ideas if you blame psychology. It's like you could say, oh, you're a racist, and say, no, I'm not. And then you could just say, oh, you're just lying about this one thing, or you're not really admitting the truth. And you can't really do anything with it.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of what wokeism does to somebody is displayed in a video by Kimi Katiti. We can link to this in the description. But she has a pretty popular video on YouTube, got 418,000 views already. She was caught up in this woke culture, and in her college days, she's from South Africa and came to the U.S. to go to school, and so she has this background of going through apartheid and seeing how Nelson Mandela tried to heal society in South Africa by using forgiveness.
Desmond Tutu, actually, primarily.
Yeah, Desmond Tutu, who wrote a couple books on forgiveness, she said. But when she came here and went to college in the U.S., she was taught CRT, critical race theory, and she described how depressed she was. She said it made her depressed and hopeless. She considered it very dark, and because it portrayed everything as like this malevolence, people were always microaggressing against her. This is where I got the example from opening the door. One of her examples of people using racism against her was that she would go to the store and then someone would fail to open the door for her. And instead of thinking that it was just someone being rude or not, or like unthinking, she would imagine that they were racist and they didn't like her, and that's why they didn't open the door. She was thinking these things all day long, like the secret motives for people's actions, and assuming that it was racism. I think this is what wokeness does to people, is it instills them with this malevolent view of everybody, and you're always constantly looking for evil psychology, evil motives, and you notice every rude thing someone does, and that gives you a negative sense of society in general, and a bad worldview.
I'm thinking of ways that can actually happen for any worldview that seems empowering at first. Like if you think of many of Ayn Rand's ideas, they could be empowering in a way that you realize what they could do for your life. But then also you might realize to what extent the world is truly screwed up. That you can realize that there's many second-handed people. There's initiation of force by the government all over the place, and you can start to feel depressed because how can you do anything if everybody's just second-handed and a zombie and you can't get anything done, right? It's like you can start to feel depressed that you're blaming them for their ignorance or whatever, and you start to get depressed and all that and get upset. And so I think some of that's a matter of, does that culture you're in provide a way to regain your empowerment, regain the positive outlook that you may have begun with? Is there something in what culture that can bring somebody to feel confident and happy again, or just at least comfortable in their life? I'm not sure if that's even possible in the usual culture we mean. And I could think even like certain Christians could maybe be depressed at first and find a new way of looking at things, or any kind of thought system, but I'm not sure if woke culture provides a way to find your happiness again. After you go through that dark portion, can you ever come back up again in that same system?
I think it would be hard to do because woke culture requires a foundation of racism.
Yeah.
You can't be awakened to a racist culture if it doesn't exist. If you start accepting the idea that, okay, now we've fixed racism and, there's no, systematic racism. It's just, petty people here and there who are racist. What are you going to do with wokeism? I mean,
even if a sci-fi situation, 10,000 years in the future, racism is gone, would woke culture go away? Would any culture go away just because they solve the problems? Or would they perpetuate the problem at some point? Or would they become a little cult? They had to start becoming mystical to even see these things anymore at one point. Like, it's not like there's any other underlying foundation, it seems. So like, oh, you solve the racism problem. Like, what other cultural foundation is there? Is there an ethical base necessarily? Or is it just simply, don't be racist? Is that all the ethical base is? Things like that. Is there anything deeper to this system? And if there isn't, then it's more and more dogmatic, probably.
In terms of just the idea of being woke, I don't think it'll go away. It's certainly not going to go away anytime soon. But even if we generally accept that institutional racism has been solved, I still don't think it'll go away, because there's also the idea of equity, and they still have this future vision of like an egalitarian society where everyone's equal, and that includes racial quotas and distribution. So even though their excuse for the discrepancies in racial numbers or statistics within, like, say, science, even though their reason for that is racism, I think they can just come up with another reason. If racism turns out to not be the problem, they'll just come up with some other reason, and it'll probably be equally ridiculous. But they'll still have the goal of equity. So that'll be their future. So I think in terms of the fundamental purpose of the culture, I think that is some sort of racial equity, or even they can expand it to sex equity, like between having the same amount of females as males in certain jobs, or anything else, like sexuality, same amount of heterosexuals to homosexuals. It could be a number of things.
Yeah, I could see that happening. I think I could even guess anything, could go any direction. I don't think it's stable enough to stay at one thing. I think it'll transform a lot in all sorts of ways.
Like if we take a really diabolical hypothesis, let's say it turns out that they all agree that genes are responsible for these differences.
Yeah.
Well, then they could create a movement for gene manipulation, and let's make everyone's genes equal. It could get really dark, and it's all because they have this vision of equity. I think that's basically what it is.
Yeah, that's intense. That would make a good story. But that,
as long as their purpose, long-term purpose or focus or orientation doesn't change, as long as they don't realize the problem with egalitarianism or racial equity or whatever you want to call it, they can come up with all sorts of means to try to achieve that end. And those means will be ridiculous. They won't work, but what they will do is cause strife and destruction and just chaos.
Yeah, and I think the real problem is more the subjective nature of what they're criticizing, not the being aware in general of truths that affect the way society functions. But the things that they're saying are the truths seem very subjective and very unruly and hard to judge. Not just hard to judge, but almost baseless when you try to judge them.
I just want to get a quick take from you on like a definition. How would you define wokeism?
I would define it as, trying to be precise here, so a cultural movement characterized by a subjective enlightenment. That might be the simplest way to put it. In the sense we've been talking about, like, you come to be aware of something, it changes your perspective on life, or changes your perspective on some phenomena, and it influences how you judge the world.
Yeah, that's pretty close to what I wrote. I didn't come up with this until this morning, but I defined it as wokeism is the religion of the primacy of consciousness orientation. Basically, they're forming principles from the belief that consciousness creates reality. We're seeing these principles in the form of things like society is inherently racist, whiteness means this or that, defund the police, create autonomous zones, let's change movies so that there's, black people instead of white people, equity on boards of directors and within employment status. So there's all kinds of ways they're applying this idea. Actually, at the root of it, I don't think it's about race. I think that's just one application of it.
Yeah, I think it's not inherently characterized by race. I don't think that's the essential part of it. It's more incidental, I think. Just the way it's working right now, but not the essential feature.
Yeah, and even if you look at the word woke, it's about consciousness.
Yes.
So I think we agree on that. And something else I wrote down is that a woman, what was her name? Kimi Katiti, said something interesting about how she felt about the ideas. And she said that it felt like it was reality, like this was the truth. It was just a fact, that there was structural racism. And I think that goes to the idea that you hear of something being the new normal. I think what's happening is wokeism is becoming the new normal for a lot of people. This is the way reality is. It's not so much a theory or a philosophy, it's science to them. It's their science. That's what it is, because their science comes out of their own consciousness. They're creating science. So it's a weird, twisted view of how you achieve knowledge and what evidence consists of. It's just all twisted.
I wonder if there's a connection with the red pill culture about men thinking that, basically misogynistic view about men and women. I mean, that almost seems like a very
probably
similar thing. I wonder if there's, culturally speaking, they stem from the same thing. I wonder, despite their superficial differences. And obviously one is about perceived, I guess, sexism against them, as in men are mistreated by women, whatever that's supposed to mean. And the same way with this wokeism, that the perceived use of race to oppress you. I think they're very similar. But that's a topic for another time.
Yeah, we'll have to get into that next time.
Yeah.
But, so any final thoughts? Or I don't have anything else.
Yeah, I like what we covered. I thought of new things. Very enlightening to me. I have a new wokeness to myself.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I'll just close it out by saying a big thank you to everyone listening. And I'll talk to you next time.
Bye, everyone.